So you're starting out with content creation. Maybe you're starting a podcast, maybe you're starting a YouTube channel, and you're wondering, should you get a dynamic microphone or a condenser microphone? You also may be looking at the budget-friendly options that are available if you're just starting out and wondering, are they worth it? Well, in this video, I'm going to try and help you with both of those questions. This is the Fifine K669D and C. These are both XLR microphones that cost just $37 each. And we're going to use them to give you samples of how a condenser microphone and a dynamic microphone sound in different recording spaces. Before we dive in, I want to mention that Fifine sent me the K669D and C for the purpose of making a review video. However, I was not paid to make this video, and Fifine will not have any say in my recommendations. Okay, so before we dive into some samples in different scenarios here, let's just talk about a couple of general things. First of all, when it comes to budget microphones, let's say microphones that are under $100, there definitely is a range of quality. Some are much better than you would expect for the price, and some are much worse than you would expect. Thankfully, I can tell you, in my opinion, both the K669D and C are better than you would expect for a price of $37. These are both XLR-only microphones with a nice build quality and a very usable sound. Now, I'll make some more specific comments about them individually as we go through our samples, but I definitely think that either way, you can get at least a few years of solid use out of these if you're just starting out. They also would make good microphones for a guest to use or something like that. Now, condenser microphones differ from dynamic microphones in a couple of ways. One primary way is that they require power to be used, specifically phantom power. The most common phantom power level that's required is 48 volts, and most audio interfaces and recorders will be able to provide 48 volts of phantom power through their XLR ports. Dynamic microphones don't require phantom power to be used. You simply turn up the gain after connecting them to an XLR input, and you'll get a signal. However, condenser microphones are much more sensitive than dynamic microphones, so they are much better at picking up a lot of information from the environment they're recording in, and not all of that information is the thing you're trying to record. So we'll talk more about that as we go through the samples, but sometimes actually having a less sensitive microphone can be a good thing. But right now, let's talk about one of the most important factors in deciding which type of microphone you're going to get, and that is your recording space. The space that you're going to be recording in most frequently plays a big role in what type of sound you're going to get, no matter which microphone you're using. Another factor is the type of content that you want to create. For example, if you're making a podcast with no video component, then you won't really care about how a microphone looks on camera. But if you are doing video content, like a YouTube talking head video like this, you might want to consider microphones that can be positioned out of frame in addition to microphones like this that you need to keep closer to you. We're going to spend most of this video considering the recording space and which one of these might be a better fit. So we're going to move around to some different spaces, and I'll give you audio samples of each of these microphones as we move through them. We're going to go from one end of the spectrum to the other, starting with a vocal booth. All right, this isn't a professionally built vocal booth. This is actually a walk-in closet that I have converted into a vocal booth for things like the voiceovers for my YouTube videos. Now, in this type of a space, as I switch back and forth between the K669D and the K669C, you're not likely going to hear an advantage in terms of one of them being better at sounding more professional, I guess. So because a condenser microphone sounds a little bit more natural, usually, compared to a dynamic microphone, in this type of a space, we would generally be reaching for a condenser microphone to get the best possible sound, the most detail, because there is no background noise and no reflections that we're worried about picking up. That's not to say you can't use a dynamic microphone in a vocal booth or a space that's heavily sound treated like this. It's just that there's no advantage to using a dynamic microphone if you're going to be in a space that has this much sound treatment. And while we're here in the vocal booth, I wanted to give you a reference point for the K669C condenser microphone. So now we are switching back and forth between the K669C and the Rode NT1 5th Gen, which is another large diaphragm condenser microphone that has a very natural and flat frequency response. Now, the NT1 5th Gen costs about $270, so over $200 more than the K669C. So let me know down in the comments, do you hear an over $200 difference between the NT1 5th Gen and the K669C? Now we're back out in my normal video recording space. This does still have quite a bit of sound treatment, but it's not at the same level as in there in the vocal booth. So there's going to be a little bit more reflections, a little bit more of that echo sound, especially if I talk louder or if I back away from the microphone. This is one thing that you generally don't want to do with these types of microphones. When you back away from these types of microphones, you are decreasing the signal to noise ratio, and that's not a good thing because now your voice won't be as loud relative to the rest of the ambient sound of the room. So even if you have a nice quiet recording space with sound treatment like this, you still want to keep these types of microphones relatively close to you. Now in this space, I've got a carpeted floor, I've got the windows covered, I've got 2 big sound blankets up on stands. So if your setup is going to be similar to this type of a space, again, I doubt you're going to hear a huge difference between the dynamic and the condenser. And now we're in the same space, just a little bit darker and a little bit louder. I've taken down all of my sound treatment except for one sheet that's behind me. My windows are uncovered now. I've turned my air conditioning back on, and there is a tower desktop computer that is running now just off screen below my desk that's making some fan noise. Now there is still a carpet in here and a bed, so there's still some soft material in here, but what I'm trying to emulate is maybe more of like a common at-home bedroom streaming possibly type of environment. And while we're in this space, I wanted to give you a reference point for the K669D. So this is the Rode Procaster. This is a dynamic broadcast style microphone that goes for a price of $230. Now there are a lot of dynamic microphones on the market in the $100 price range that we could use for a comparison, but I specifically chose the Procaster here because it's a great example of a dynamic microphone with a little bit less of a boosted high frequency range, and it's also very well known for its ability to minimize background noises. And we've made it all the way to the other end of the spectrum of our recording spaces. We are in, that room. So this is representative of a worst case scenario recording space. It's all hard surfaces, nothing soft to absorb any of these reflections. It is an echo chamber. In a space that's this bad for recording, honestly, no microphone, no matter how cheap or expensive, is going to make a space like this actually sound professional and high quality. So the main takeaway for this type of a space is you really need to either pick a different space if you can, or invest in improving the space. But that is a good reason to look at budget-friendly microphones like the K669D and C when you're just getting started, because if you only have a certain amount of budget to invest in this hobby or this business maybe that you're starting, unless you already have a professional studio space or a room that is super quiet with very, very little reflections, you're gonna be better off spending more of that budget on improving the space and less of the budget on the microphone, at least at first. Okay, so hopefully all of those samples demonstrated how dynamics and condensers differ in terms of how they pick up sound in different recording environments. Now let's just talk about a couple more things that are specific to these two microphones. First up, the K669D dynamic microphone. This mic has a sensitivity of -50 dBV, which actually is pretty high sensitivity for a dynamic microphone. And especially for beginners, that can be a good thing because it means you don't need to seek out an interface or recorder that has a really high amount of gain to power it. Even an interface like a Scarlett Solo from Focusrite, which only has about 56 dB of gain, you'll be able to power one of these perfectly fine. Now, by now you've also noticed that the K669D has a pretty crispy sound profile to it. They boosted the high end on this one, maybe a little bit too much for some people. I would say if you have a higher pitched voice, this might be a little bit too much for you. However, you can tame it down a little bit with some EQ. It's also not the smoothest sound in the high frequencies. However, smooth sounding dynamic microphones that are under $100 are pretty rare. It definitely has more of a radio broadcast style sound to it. So if you're making a podcast, a video podcast, anything like that, I think it would be a nice option. Now, the downsides with the K669D are two things. Number one, it is pretty susceptible to plosives. Even if you're speaking, slightly off axis like this, where you're not talking directly into it, the plosives, they're pretty noticeable. However, just adding a foam windscreen to it will clean that up quite a bit. And the second downside is the handling noise. The K669D, even if I just bump this cable, or if I bump the stand that it's on, or if I bump the table, it's pretty susceptible, and it's almost like a little bit resonant where the low frequency bumps kind of ring through the microphone. So definitely wouldn't recommend leaving this on your desk. I would get it on a boom arm and just really try not to bump it. Now, the K669C definitely has a different sound profile. It's a lot less boosted or hyped in the higher frequencies, so it doesn't have that sharper sound to it. It's definitely smoother than the K669D in the higher frequencies. It's still got some warmth. It's maybe a little bit muddled in the low mids, but overall it's got a much more natural sound than the K669D. Now, Fifine doesn't provide a self-noise figure for the K669C in the documents that were provided. But just looking at the waveforms while I'm not talking, I do think it might be a little on the high side. However, at the same time, I never really noticed the self-noise becoming a problem, even after I normalized my levels to minus 16 LUFS, which you've been hearing that throughout this entire video. No noise reduction was used at all for this video. So the K669C is also, surprisingly, a little bit better at handling the bumps. If I bump the stand or bump the cable, you know, it's going to pick that up, but it doesn't seem to resonate as much as the K669D, at least not the one that I received. So if your recording space is conducive to using a condenser microphone, I do think the K669C is a great budget option. Overall, I think either one is a great budget option that provide quality above their price point for sure. Now, both of them do come with small desk stands. However, as I mentioned, I would recommend either one of them. I would put them on a boom arm so that the desk bumps won't make it into your recording. So ultimately, I do recommend these. Are they the best choice for everyone? No, they're not. If your budget is, going to go to that $100 or over $100 price point, then there certainly are lots of other options for you to consider. If you want some more options, I have a video where I cover all of my favorite podcast microphones at all different price points. I'll link to that in the description. But if you're trying to keep your budget at the $50 or under price point, then I see no reason not to give these a try. All right, so that'll do it for this video. Let me know down in the comments if you found it helpful. Do me a favor, hit that like button if it was helpful. Let me know if you have either of these microphones and how you're liking them. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the Semi Pro Tech and Gear channel. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.